lately, there has been a great interest in revisiting pop art, mostly exploring its manifestations and diversity in the global arena, looking for alternative models that engages the sensibility of pop, celebrating, criticizing, and moreover, cannibalizing and inserting it into a broader social political context. Two recent exhibitions address the topic from an international point of view. Currently, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis is exhibiting international pop, which is traveling to the Dallas Museum of Art and to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In September 2015, the Tate Modern in London opens The World Goes Pop. The exhibition will travel to the Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo. Both exhibitions review how artists from different countries put their own individual, local spin on pop art, telling alternative histories with a critical twist. When I proposed this talk on pop to the Bronx Museum, I was asked to include lots of work by Robert Rauschenberg. So I was intrigued by this request and started searching for its motivation. First and foremost, I found that Rauschenberg represents the most celebrated post-war American artist in the international arena, having been self-appointed the cultural ambassador of the US abroad. No other American artist traveled or exhibited abroad as extensively as Rauschenberg did in the 60s. During Rauschenberg's long and celebrated career, he died in 2008 at age 82. He participated in numerous international exhibitions and was the first US-American artist to win the grand prize at the Venice Biennale in 1964. This prize was the breakpoint for the US cultural recognition and acceptance abroad. However, it became a double-edged sword in Rauschenberg's career. After World War II, only European artists had received this major prize in Venice, especially the ones living in Paris, such as George Braque, Henri Matisse, and Max Ernst, among others. So to give the grand prize in painting to an American artist was the same as to acknowledge the shift from European cultural hegemony to US power. So I'm showing you an early image of Rauschenberg here, and his works being traveled to the Venice Biennale. He showed at the American consulate in Venice in '64. This prize, however, became an immediate scandal because of the widespread perception that the United States had maneuvered things behind the scenes through an orchestration by the US Pavilion curator Alan Solomon and Rauschenberg's dealer in New York, Leo Castelli. The prize became suspiciously seen as a result of a conspiracy to promote American culture abroad. Headlines in the French press read, "Venice colonized by America." At home, the New York Herald Tribune published an article titled, "The Merchandise of Venice," playing with the pun of Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice. The year of 1964 was an intrepid moment for Rauschenberg. He joined the Merce Cunningham Dance Company as the costume and set designer for the first world tour. But his experience with the Cunningham Dance Company did not end well. The artist parted ways after the last stop of the world's tour in Japan, partially due to the fact that Rauschenberg was already internationally more well-known than Cunningham and John Cage, and attracted all the media attention wherever the company traveled. After he received the grand prize at the Venice Biennale, Rauschenberg immediately became an international celebrity. His most renowned works were the Combines, which he had already exhibited in Paris at the Ileana Sonnenberg's gallery. In his Combines, Rauschenberg updated the collage technique using ready-made objects and popular imagery. His Combines were innovative hybrids of painting and sculpture, creating an entirely new artistic mode in the visual arts. Bed, that's here on the left, was one of Rauschenberg's first combines from 1955. Here he used a worn pillow, a sheet, a quilt as his support, scribbled on them with pencil, and splashed them with paint in a style still reminiscent of abstract expressionism. The story goes that these were Rauschenberg's own bed clothes, giving the work a personal imprint. In Monogram from 1959 on the right, probably his most provocative combine, he placed a stuffed goat standing on a low platform with a car tire around its torso. Some people at first thought it was a live goat, igniting a sort of protest until they understood that Rauschenberg had bought the stuffed goat in the window of a second-hand office furniture store in New York. These works brought major changes to the pictorial field. Moreover, they challenged the prevailing formalist notion defined by the influential critic Clement Greenberg of the medium's specificity or the self-referential unity of a work of art. By creating a work in between the fields of painting and sculpture, Rauschenberg went against the tenets of the demigod Greenberg. While Greenberg dismissed Rauschenberg's work, not even considering it to be art, the influential art critic Leo Steinberg came to his rescue, coining the term flatbed picture plane to advocate for the artist's new pictorial surface, and Debbie mentioned that this morning. Steinberg wrote that even if Rauschenberg's combine are hung on the wall, the pictures kept referring back to the horizontals on which we walk and sit, we work and sleep. In other words, for Steinberg, Rauschenberg combines opened the visual arts to incorporate the world outside it, bringing everyday life into it. As Rauschenberg famously said, quote, "Painting relates to both art and life. I try to act in the gap between the two," unquote. In addition to the combines, Rauschenberg introduced a series of innovations to American art, incorporating techniques such as photographs, silk screens, transfer drawings, film, and all sorts of available technology and printmaking, as we saw today. He used urban debris, imagery from the news, posters, magazines, and ready-mades as his prime materials, all of which were precursors to techniques later co-opted by many artists around the world. In the mid-50s, Rauschenberg, however, was still dripping a la Jackson Pollock. His combined rebus from 1955, he used in this combine everyday materials such as comic strips, political posters, fabric, and drawings. In this combine, images and objects from the external world were displayed without any hierarchy or intentional connection, creating a cacophony in the space. But because of his appropriation of images and objects related to American culture, such as Coca-Cola bottles, eagles, John Kennedy, and so forth, he became acclaimed as the new representative of American art, surpassing the previous generation of abstract expressionist artists as the main cultural US agent. At home, Rauschenberg became the quintessential American artist. His combined Coca-Cola plan from 1958, for instance, was seen as a double celebration of America, a cheerful homage to the Coca-Cola brand with a reference to the US aid post-war Europe through the Marshall Plan, and you see the word plan there in the combine. But some of his works was also allowed for contradictory readings. For instance, in his silkscreen painting Buffalo 2 from 1963, he incorporates images of President Kennedy, an astronaut, and as well as several seemingly unrelated objects. Its collage-like disjunctive style, connecting and disconnecting disparate elements, could be read either as a neutral reflection of the rapid changes of times or as a symbol of Americanism. The work was considered both unbiased and affirmative of US culture, depending on one's point of view. Rauschenberg was not only an acclaimed artist in the West, but he was also celebrated in Eastern countries under communist regimes. If at home his work was often considered impartial or even optimistic, abroad it was on the contrary seen as critical of American culture. So how come, you might ask? Well, ironically, the same recognizable and accessible imagery seen in his work, its use of elements from everyday life, his integration of art and life, and his return to figuration, paradoxically conveyed similar basic tenets of socialist realism. Moreover, his accessible, legible art made Rauschenberg known as the anti-capitalist or the anti-bourgeois artist abroad. This made him be well received in countries with totally opposing political regimes from the US. Through the representational mode of his imagery and his accessibility, Rauschenberg was promoting, depending on the context and the circumstances, either as the ultimate expression of American culture or as the champion of socially realist aesthetics. So was Rauschenberg a representative of the US abroad, or was he an anti-capitalist artist? Was he really the best artist around during the Venice Biennale, deserving the grand prize, or just a fraud, a mere fabrication of US politics and economic hegemony? Was he a representative of the left or from the right? Did he embody the American dream, or did he reject it? He left all these questions open-ended, keeping a passive attitude and letting his supporters and detractors fight among themselves. More than anything else, he was a chameleon-like figure, always willing to embrace ambiguity in the reception of his work and his politics. He repeatedly showed his distaste for any attempt to give a specific meaning to his work. He wanted it to be open to all possible readings. He also maintained a tone of neutrality when asked about politics, implying that his work was apolitical. After all, Rauschenberg considered his art to be about inclusions and not exclusions. His non-confrontational, embracing, and friendly personality was reflected in the kaleidoscopic work and in his undecisive politics. For many scholars, the export of post-war American art was seen as a form of Cold War propaganda, and artists like Rauschenberg, the product of cultural imperialism. But the impact and dissemination that Rauschenberg's work had abroad undeniably influenced generations of artists all over the world and spread American art as a cross-cultural phenomenon in which each country and artist appropriated its bold visual language to use it for their own purposes. Although this new visuality fascinated artists all over, they also had reservations about it, since it was seen as a celebration of mass media and consumerism, and a move to intentionally advance art produced for the market, particularly after the entrance into the scene of Andy Warhol. Following Rauschenberg's steps in aestheticizing and recontextualizing objects from everyday life, Warhol, 3 years younger and the son of Slovakian working-class immigrants, differently from Rauschenberg, willingly and unequivocally embraced consumption as the fabric of the American dream. Both Rauschenberg and Warhol anticipated the development of the art world by decades. If Rauschenberg was the first American artist to go global, Warhol, in turn, was the first American artist who understood the significance of consumer goods as universal objects of desire. In one of his well-known statements, he said, quote, "The president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and can you imagine, you can also drink Coke." For Warhol, the attainment of equality among people was not based on any principle of the common good, but on the equalitarian access to consumption. Furthermore, Warhol's work relied primarily on imagery of affluent consumer society, a connection that further established his association to American power and imperialism. With Warhol, there was a shift from labor to commerce, from production to consumption. When he was asked if he wanted to be a great artist, he replied, quote, "No, I'd rather be famous." He sought fame for the sake of fame without any need for a justified noble cause. Unlike Rauschenberg, who was scattered and ambivalent about his work and politics, Warhol has pervasively denied any political connotation related to his artwork and claimed to have produced his images as indifferent as a machine. As he once cynically explained, if you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films, and me, and there I am. There's nothing behind it. His portraits of Marilyn Monroe from 1962, done immediately after she had committed suicide, places her silkscreen face against a golden background like an iconic religious Byzantine painting. The source for this image was a still from the movie Niagara from 1953. After cropping, copying, composing, and coloring the image, what could have stood for a morbid portrait of the diseased movie star ended up becoming a glamorous depiction of her celebrity aura, also showing his fixation with the loss of the object/subject. Warhol knew how to exploit the imperfections of the photo screen process, the blurs, the variations of inking, the surface incidents, as he himself called them. And the more he repeated identical images, the more their accumulation made differences between them apparent and underscore their individuality, making them always look unique. But his main accomplishment, undoubtedly, was turning himself into a brand, into a commodity name. Like Rauschenberg, he was interested in everyday life, but in a naive way, or at least that is what he pretended it to be. While Rauschenberg said, in a poetic way, I always wanted my work, whatever happened in the studio, to look more like what was going on outside the window, Warhol bluntly stated about his Campbell Soup series. I used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years. I guess the same thing over and over again. Warhol's first version of the Campbell Soup cans, which is here, was still hand-painted, making each one of the canvas different from the other, right? There are subtle discrepancies. It's all kind of handmade, and there are subtle discrepancies among the paintings. For instance, the reds and the whites, they differ slightly in tone from one canvas to the next. This series follows the concept of difference and repetition, where there's no original, only repetition, and nothing is ever the same. When Warhol first exhibited his Campbell Soup cans in 1962 at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles, each of the 32 canvases rested on a horizontal shelf mounted on the wall, like in a grocery store. The number of paintings correspond to the varieties of soup sold by then, and they were arranged in rows, reflecting the chronological order in which they were introduced in the market, beginning with the tomato soup on the upper left. Warhol gave a clean look to his imagery of consumer goods. There is a famous anecdote from 1962 in which he showed two paintings of a Coke bottle to the filmmaker Emile D'Antonio and to his dealer Ivan Karp, and asked them which one he should exhibit. One of the Coke canvases had painterly drippings that read as traces of abstract expressionism, while the other was almost as pristine as the commercial label on the product itself. His friends opted for the crisp and cool look, and boom, pop was born. Since its inception, pop art became a contested field, both in the US and abroad. It was simultaneously celebrated as a new drive towards cosmopolitanism and internationalization, as well as criticized for its association with the US government, capitalism, militarism, and domination. Much like Warhol's images of Hollywood celebrities such as Marilyn Monroe, Liz Taylor, and Elvis Presley, the figure of the figure of the revolutionary Che Guevara became a ubiquitous pop symbol in Latin America. His photograph, taken by the Cuban Alberto Corda from 1960, was immediately appropriated and transformed into a popular icon. In protesting against the commercialization of this canonical image, the Argentinian artist Roberto Jacobi humorously created a serigraphy with the caption, I'll try my Spanish here. Un guerrillero no muere para que se lo cuelgue en la pared. Jacobi, like many artists in Latin America, considered pop to be apolitical and an instrument of US imperialism. In truth, any association with North America was distasteful to Latin American artists because of the US government's support of the military regimes in the region, and therefore they did not embrace the American dream, eagerly resisting it. Moreover, for many artists around the globe, access to international contemporary art was limited because of economic realities that make travel abroad very difficult. Artists who were awarded grants by their governments could travel, but mostly the closest contact that many artists had at the time with pop art was through reproductions in international magazines. However, with time, a certain distance from the beginning of pop art and a closer contact with the original works allowed to a more complex reading, exposing their nuances and avoiding a solely black and white interpretation. This revisionist analysis brought a new dimension to pop, revealing a more dynamic understanding of its political implications. Warhol was not as ambivalent as Rauschenberg, but his work was also not so unequivocal as it might have seemed. Beginning in the 60s, he dealt with numerous social issues in his images: race riots, the death penalty, political assassinations, the atomic bomb, and as well as he addressed political figures and symbols like Mao Zedong, the hammer and the sickle, John Kennedy, and Jackie Onassis or Kennedy. Images of death seems to have haunted him, especially in his Death and Disaster series from 1962 until 1967, in which he captured the dark side of America. In this series, he depicted car and airplane crashes, disasters, suicides, electric chairs, atomic bomb explosions, and civil riots. In one of his most striking silkscreen canvas, the Red Race Riot from 1963, he boldly shows police dogs being used against civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. This series was made from photographs taken by Charles Moore and reproduced in Life magazine. It takes us wonder whether Warhol was really as devoid of any political interest as he had repeatedly claimed to be. In Saturday Disaster from 1964, he shows two stacked black and white screen-printed images of a fatal car crash. In the reading of this series, the art historian Thomas Crow wrote, "In these events, the supreme symbol of consumer affluence, the American car of the 1950s, has ceased to be an image of pleasure and freedom and has become a concrete instrument of sudden and irreparable injury." In Orange Disaster from 1963, Warhol used acrylic and silkscreen to repeat 15 times the image of an empty electric chair in the execution chamber of the Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York, in an allusion to the heated discussion of the death penalty at the time. His blurring of the images, his washing of its color, and his use of repetition makes us feel close and apart to these images at the same time. In regarding the pain of others, the American writer Susan Sontag defines photojournalism's main motto as, "It bleeds, it leads." In a world bombarded by journalistic images of poverty, tragedy, and exploitation, it is easy to be numbed and indifferent to violence. Sontag further states that the image of shock and the image as cliché are two aspects of the same presence. Warhol Death and Disaster series evoked the anesthesia and saturation created by the bombardment of tragic images in the media. It attempts to reenact the banality of the cliched image, especially if we consider that the series was done during the impact caused by the introduction of color TV sets in the US in the 60s. In this way, it can be said that paradoxically, Warhol, the grand master of consumerism, had banalized and aestheticized traumatic images of death to avoid the possibility of a passive act of their consumption by the viewer. This morbid and political series from the early 60s seems to have been an exception in his work. Later in his career, and before his death in 1987 at age 59, Warhol became a right-wing media promoter, a wealthy personality, a quasi-mythical figure, achieving the same level of celebrity status as his idols, Marilyn Monroe and Liz Taylor and Jackie Kennedy. For many, he became a pastiche of his own fabricated persona, an iconic symbol of a cynical superstar. Here I'm just showing that a lot of the images that he used, they came from his own personal archives of images, of photojournalistic images and photographs. By the late 70s, he was accused of being superficial, commercial, and banal. His infamous early statement that he started as a commercial artist and wanted to finish as a business artist was finally fulfilled. Meanwhile, Rauschenberg went into his most prominent global undertaking, the Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Interchange project known as ROCI, pronounced Rocky, and named after his pet turtle. The project took place from '84 until '91, when the artists traveled with the mission to promote peace and the understanding among diverse cultures through art. The tour had 11 stops, including one here in Havana in 1988. In Havana, his work was shown in several venues, including here, the Museo Nacional de Belas Artes, the Castillo de la Fuerza, Casa de las Américas, and Galeria Haidé Santa Maria. While in Cuba, Rauschenberg did a series of paintings on aluminum and steel, evoking the pre-1959 American cars seen here in Havana. He also referred to the sugar plantations in works such as Sugar Night from 1985. As always, his paintings were not only celebrated, but also criticized. This time, he was blamed for not addressing the complete history of Cuba. So to conclude, despite the title given to my talk, The Art of the Banal, the Pop Era, there's very little of banal related to pop art. Since its beginning, it aroused critical ambivalence, contradictions, and paradoxes in the US and abroad. Basically, different places and cultures took from it what they wanted it to be, depending on their own context and circumstances. And it is precisely this elasticity, divergence, and discrepancy aroused by these various possible readings of the pop era that still make it resilient and interesting as an artistic production. After all these years, it is exactly this ambiguity, as seen in the early works by Rauschenberg and Warhol, that still makes us want to decipher pop art in its multiple complexities. Thank you.